My time will start now. To be a member of a marginalized community, specifically in the societies that which we live under, is to live under an oppressive regime. To be in a situation where you are told you are not right, you are told you are not normal, and you are faced with psychological violence on the daily. Because of this, we can see that there are very, very clear incentives that I will now give in a few pieces of framing that an author from minority background would specifically have. First, being marginalized in a society leads to consistent levels, as I just mentioned, of psychological violence. This, in and of itself, means that mitigating that is probably a priority for a member of a minority community, no matter what. This means that when they write, in the words of Hélène Cixous, women must write herself. It is the only path to liberation. They can share their experiences, feel seen and known, and have a healthy way where they can communicate their own lived experiences. We believe this is probably a priority because one, this violence that they face on the day-to-day could be paralyzing to the author, could stop them from creating future work, and could stop their entire existence. And second, is probably the most important thing in their life. And on top of that, we would also say that it's really important to have other people understand and find solace in your work, specifically for members of your own community, so that they can also feel seen. Second piece of incentive analysis is that you also are probably worried about understanding for members of the out group, not members of your group, because you are writing, you are publishing, you are putting works of literature out into the world. You're not just writing in your own journal, which means they're meant to be seen and consumed. And you know, as a member of a marginalized group, that your words are always going to be associated with you as a person. You can never separate that because you are always going to be seen as an author of that group. So no matter what work of literature you reach, it's always going to be seen as a representation of that group as a whole. Third piece is that we also understand that there's probably some financial incentive, but we would say this is probably not the most important thing because you are one, self-selecting into a objectively not that high-paying job. There's a reason we have an understanding of like the cliche of the starving artist amongst other things, because people have other like reasons to have value and solace in their own work. However, we also understand that you need to like eat, have a house, and live your own life. So there is some minor level there. Second piece of framing is what is fiction and why is the actor writing fiction? Opposition is going to get up here and tell you why escapism is at the core, that historical fact is fundamentally irrelevant, but this is quite clearly wrong because the main thing that fiction enables you to do, especially on both sides of the house in this debate, which takes some ground in grounding in the material world and the world in which we live under, is that fiction enables creative liberties. People are put off by troubling literature. People don't want to encounter and face the violence that exists for many people every single day in their lives. These historical books about marginalized communities don't sell as well. That's why fiction can actively be an incredibly useful tool to still share those beliefs in a more consumable and palatable way, which makes it a significantly better vehicle for one, the liberation we talked about earlier, and two, changing individuals' minds. With that, let's get into some positive argumentation. Our main argument here is going to be about how fiction, and specifically reinterpretive fiction, enables a more faithful to accuracy and expression because comparatively, you are able to express the exact same message with more within a similar context as opposed to lengthy, wide allegories that can only vaguely represent it. There's a few mechanisms here. First, there are specific nuances to actual suffering and marginalized groups that exist within our world in our present society that an allegory can never fully capture. If you are writing about the context of anti-blackness and you do not start with the transatlantic slave trade, you are never going to be able to encapsulate the entire issue in and of itself. Sure, you can draw some parallels, you can have some analogies here and there, but you're never going to encapsulate the depth of the entire issue, which means that one, you are always going to be leaving things out, and two, people may misinterpret your work, which leads to the second mechanism, misinterpretation. Cultural elements in and of themselves are very liable to be misinterpreted, whether that be because many cultures share similar elements, or two, because people just don't understand the work in and of itself. Go to the Infoslide where they give you the example of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where there are many interpretations of the Fire Nation as an allegory for the Nazi Party or Nazi Germany. They're not. It's obviously, not obviously, but it is an allegory for Imperial Japan. But the fact that in and of itself, people can confuse and misinterpret those two, which means that a lot of the unique value that you would be attaining from reading it, if you are a member of that context, if your family was victimized by Imperial Japan, you don't actually end up being able to get it. Third, You can be hyper-specific. When you are able to reinterpret cultural context, this enables you to actively validate people for reading that story because they are able to see things that they can see in their everyday life. You can take actual elements, actual people's stories, actual historical events that happened, and then reinterpret those or share those in a way that is more useful for everybody. Is there a POI from closing or, yeah.
Yeah, the problem is that people don't take alternative history fiction seriously. They think of it as fan fiction. If you concede that you want people to accept and internalize this, literally historical fiction is actually well accepted. For example, see the works of Toni Morrison or the novel that 12 Years a Slave was based upon.
Well, absolutely. I think that this sort of links directly back into our case, where yes, when you only take vague elements, people do see it as just fiction. They see you as writing fan fiction. But if you actually take real people's stories and real events that happened, such as in the work of Toni Morrison, like in Beloved, that cleanly falls on the government side of the house because you are taking actual events and you are simply telling a story within those contexts. You are not creating alternative history on our side of the house. You are instead re-explaining events that happened from the perspective and the cultural context from the marginalized communities that they exist under. This meets the direct incentive of the actors because they're actually able to share their own stories from their own culture. There's a couple impacts here. First, members of minority groups can feel represented. They're underrepresented in history. No one is buying their history books because one, there's significantly a smaller market, so they don't exist as much. And second, there's not a tangible incentive to do so if you're not a member of the group, which means at the very least you can see people that look like you can see discussions of issues that involve you in popular culture, which can validate you and make you feel better. And second, it's important for the out group because it's hard to empathize with culture alone. A lot of these depictions take a ton of liberties. Avatar oversimplifies issues. Dune is very orientalist with the depiction of Jews and Arabs, and the transformative work inherently captures the humanity of the experience because you're focusing on characters and stories of actual everyday experiences. And then third, universality. A work that focuses on people in a specific context will always be accurate. It's like biblical parables. However, fiction that derives from a culture may become irrelevant if the culture that it's derived from shifts over time as opposed to demonstrating a specific cultural context. Thank you. Very proud opening government.
I thank the Prime Minister for this fine speech, and to open the opposition side of the debate, I'm happy to call the leader of opposition here.
I'll be taking POI in chat. If I don't take a POI by 5:30, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask for a POI vocally. On my next word. Opening government cannot win this debate simply because the kind of fiction that they're trying to create essentially doesn't sound like a fiction at all. Because their argument is that you want to take real people, real events, real circumstances, real power dynamics. We're unsure how the fiction is necessarily creeping in here to begin with. And this is what the principal problem with OG's case is. If you want to capture actual events to the depth of entire issue, to the way that it should never be misinterpreted by the kinds of themes and literary interpretations, necessarily means that this kind of history can only be captured in a real history books, not even like a reinterpretive kind of a history fiction. Therefore, for OG's characterization of what authors should write about and what kind of writings do have an impact in society, that is only achievable in a world, only achievable through the medium of real history rather than any kind of fiction whatsoever, because all of the issues that they identify are with transformative history, transformative fiction is with reinterpretive fiction itself. So we think that OG fails to meet its burden in properly trying to contextualize what reinterpretive fiction is going to look like. Secondly, in terms of what characterizing the interests of the author, a couple of points of framing. First, the authors are not writing these books as a minority author just for purposes of catharsis. They are building a career out of it. Therefore, their careerist incentives matter here immensely. They are trying to have greater reach, mass acclaim. They want to get as many publishing as possible, more reviews. These are the careerist goals that they necessarily need. So even if we accept the OG's premises that they want some form of catharsis and want to represent their voices, the likelihood of success is a priority in your ability to reach your material and cathartic elements to the widest audience possible. Lastly, in terms of financial goal, is not a secondary consideration for these authors. Sure, they don't want to become as rich as people who pursue a career in hedge fund and investment banking, but they do have careers, financial goals in terms that they want this to be able to have a good life and be able to survive for their lives on this career. Now, a couple of points of why transformative writing is better than the reinterpretive fiction in terms of your benefits as a writer and your likelihood of success. First, it gives you full creative freedom and creative agencies. This means that you can explore new possibilities of writing fiction, which in OG's world you cannot, because you are unshackled from historical trauma and limitations of reinterpretation history. Because there are very limited number of events, limited number of actors, and a limited number of power dynamics and issues that you can explore, which is especially problematic given that you're a minority. Why? Because as a minority, this means that there are only going to be very few limited number of themes, and you'll be crowded out because there is less originality in whatever you produce, because so many other minority writers, all of the minority writers are writing around same ideas, same themes, same issues, and which is why the distinguishing factor will be less, means that your ability to distinguish yourself and stand out is going to be harder. Second, your ability to make and produce a lot of work is limited as well in terms of continuation of series. A lot of fiction writers have an incentive to write like long series, for instance, prequels, sequels, multiple like chains within the same storylines. It is difficult to write when you're exclusively focusing on historical events, because most of historical events do not have a clean prequel, sequel, the way fantasy fiction writers actually want. Maybe in some instances, like you may have World War I, World War II, but then what? Things are dramatically changed in the world, which is why it's harder for you to place those sequels and prequels and all those kinds of things. Therefore, it also means that your ability to produce, your ability to reach out to other mediums, for instance, in movies, getting your fiction work translated into movies is harder, because the big banners are looking for the novels and works which they can have for a longer time horizons, like 20 years, 30 years, create trilogies, create long series. Therefore, you're much likely to succeed under our world when you have more creative freedom and creative agency. Second, it's better if you have the ability to avoid the burden of representation, because if you're under OG's world, you will have a constant pressure to get the parallels correct and parallels right in reinterpreting the historical events. Because if you're wearing the hat of a minority representative, this means that you have to represent the entire communal experience. And note panel, the communal experience within minorities is not homogeneous either. It's intersectional, it's varied. A gay black man's experience of transatlantic slave trade might be potentially different than black women. Therefore, it's harder to capture the nuances on those levels, and therefore you will face greater scrutiny when you fail to capture all of those nuances, because you're explicitly trying to do so, and which is why you will face more scrutiny and more criticism from within a community as well as outside community as well. You're much likely to get more bad reviews in how you have failed to get good capturing and good ability to capture nuances, and therefore likely to get less visibility because you get bad reviews or you get more criticism. Third, there's a high bar to meet when you're interpreting history, because notice, it is more hard for minorities to succeed, because when you're reinterpreting history, it means you need a proper prior knowledge of history as well as a writer, which means that you need to have a lot of broad-based education about a lot of different facets, about sociology, anthropology, about history, and have to be able to see them from different lenses. As a minority writer, it is likely that you do not have that a lot of those financial ability and historically like education and the ability to have all of these varied kind of education. So therefore, it's easier and less barrier to entry when you're writing on a transformative aspect. Secondly, in terms of time aspect, but before that, if closing has something.
Yeah, so do you care more about your career, as you said at the start of your speech, or is it creative freedom in writing long books?
We don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive. They're pretty intertwined, and we think that will prove sufficiently in our case. Thirdly, we think that it's harder, it takes longer to publish reinterpreting history, fantasy, because you have to research a lot, you have to read a lot of books, you have to go through the events in a lot of detail, which means that the time for publishing books elongates, means your ability to produce greater quantity of work and better quality of work reduces, which is harder because as a minority, you need financial stability, because you have generally minority authors tend to have less access to capital. Thirdly, secondly, within this, you also need your audience to be able to appreciate the historical aspects as well. If your audience do not have the prior historical knowledge of the events, they might not be able to appreciate it to that extent, because they won't be able to understand the nuances of it. And if there's a cognitive mismatch, the novel or the fantasy would not be well received. Lastly, we think that universal themes that are captured in transformative approach with cultural nuances, but which are not just reinterpreting specific histories, have a broader appeal, and you access a wider audience externally. As OG claims, this is also an incentive for the authors. This means that your story is more accessible to broader audience. Why teenage kids who want to have a good time reading before sleep, adults who want to have just read good fiction story before a good night's sleep. You access these these audiences better under our world, which means you get better acclaim, better recognition, and for all of the reasons, because you get better accessibility, better likelihood of success. Therefore, as a minority writer, very proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for this fine speech, and to continue with government side debate, I'm happy to call the DPM. Here.
Okay, can I be heard? Yes? Yeah?
Can you repeat that?
What? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, brilliant. I was a bit worried for a moment there, given you didn't seem to hear me, but that's fine. All right, let's do this. I'll take closing, probably at 5:30. The death of the author has been greatly exaggerated, and the case coming from opening government is remarkably simple. We tell you why it is that from the position in which you're in, the most likely reason that you ever became an author and the story you most want to tell will be the one relating to historical background and your unique ability to use it to both tell a story that is new while speaking to people across time and across different cultures. What opposition are settling for is a work that is going to be mediocre. It's going to be number 50 of the works that adapt a specific culture. We give you the unique way in which you can tell a compelling story, and that is why you have to vote for side opening government. Let me first discuss then the clash that relates to the interests of the actor. And I think that, like, notably, when someone goes into being like an author, it is something which you realize is not going to have like a very good pay. You're someone who cares about your work reaching people, and I just firmly reject the premise that you went into it because, you just want to sell a few books. Notably, you're writing because you want to make people feel something. What a cursory visit to your local bookstore is going to tell you is that the number of authors that is like multiple orders larger than the numbers of successful authors. What this means then is that just because you are an author, you cannot assume in this debate that you're going to be good at writing things, or that the works that opposition are going to be producing are necessarily going to be, like cult classics or very, very good. Note then why you chose to become an author. It is a job which you do because you want to fulfill the sorts of obligations that Zach told you about in the first speech. You see it as a position in which you can both represent your people and the understanding of the community really large as of the group you're from and the suffering that your group has been in the past. Notably, these are not just things that you're saying for the sake of it. These are things which are important to you and to your life and to your understanding of the world in which you live, and they're equally important as matters of understanding for the people who are interpreting your work. Two implications here. Firstly, you will be better at writing the books that tend to play to your strengths. What I'm going to prove in positive case is why reinterpreted works are far easier to write and why we therefore produce better books than side opposition does. Second implication, though, is that Owo here says that you avoid the burden of misrepresentation. Owo can be happy to live this life of mediocrity, but I think I proved to you why this is a burden which you're happy to bear. It is one which you would feel most fulfilled if you have the ability to carry out, and you uniquely do this on our side. I would far rather write a compelling work that tells, for example, the story of Greece during the occupation by the Ottomans and the suffering of the people there, rather than to be one of the writers of like Avatar, The Last Airbender, and congrats, I got to write one of the big kids' shows and people know my name for 10 years. I think there's something uniquely fulfilling and universal about getting to write something which appeals to multiple individuals. On to positive case here. Firstly, then, why are reinterpretive works going to be far more compelling? Just like quickly reiterating what Zach said and adding, given we got literally no response from side opposition. Firstly, they invite people to think for themselves about these historical events in a way that makes them uniquely engaging. Note then why it is that works that literally focus on the event itself are far less compelling. When it's the case that you're being spoon-fed the event, or when the reader feels that they have to take a specific position as to what happened, you often tend to zone out. You see the work that is like prescriptive and dictative dictating to you. When you have the ability to make these alterations, that is precisely when the reader places themselves in the work itself. That is when they reach their own conclusions, and that is when they can empathize with the characters. And that is when you feel that you're not just empathizing because you feel like you have to, because you're a bad person if you don't, but rather that you see that there is something about the pattern of events which unfolded, which is universal. Regardless of the specific circumstances, any case like that case is one which you're able to condemn. And you uniquely get that by able to use the historical context. Secondly, though, you're just able to rely on historical truths to tell these stories. There's a reason why these stories unfolded as they did in the first place. And this means that there's like a very unique sense of authenticity when you're telling these stories. I would note the example of like biblical allegories, right? Which don't necessarily tell you about the culture of the people, but rather they tell you about like, the day-to-day events or the specific instances in which people participated in those events, which lets you put yourself in their place. The analytic reason here is clear. Empathy doesn't come from culture because other people are never going to experience your culture as their own. Empathy is about appealing to the common humanity between the reader and the writer, that which prompts care and deep understanding of the horror that is suffering and of the history of the group which you're a part of. Therefore, then, I think you uniquely write better works on our side. The second reason, though, is just very practical. Why is it then that regardless of the actual authenticity, these works are going to be a lot easier to write in terms of like good and best-selling works? Three reasons here. Firstly, it is a lot more time-consuming and difficult to create a plot in a fantasy world from complete scratch. A culture is a very broad context in which many stories can be written, and most of those stories are probably going to be dog shit. Like you're going to be like, Tolkien ripoff like number 50, like Lord of the Rings copy number 50. There's a unique thing that you can do when you're talking about your culture suffering, and in a manner that historically is far more different than that of different cultures as well. I will here just assert that there are like common elements of suffering, and yeah, sure, this is true to some extent, but I want to note that like every human being has a culture. Most cultures haven't been through the same degree of tragedy or the uniqueness of tragedy that many of these groups have. So I just don't think that all can just wave their hands and symmetrize this. The second reason, though, conversely, though, is that there's something authentic about adapting real-life stories. These events are nuanced, and you can take these details from real life and use them to tell a good story in itself without feeling repetitive or without feeling like you're copying. If anything, when people notice these details, they appreciate that you have put them in there because they feel like you're speaking to the historicity and the experience that you have gone through. Notably, before opposition to a tantrum here, you're going to be sensitive to the correct interpretation of these stories, far more so than the comparative. Because you're part of these groups, you're going to represent these people with respect as you understand what they go through. The comparative is far, far worse. When the understanding of like the events is like filtered through a lens of closing, please. Yeah, closing.
If the human experience is universal and people can empathize with experiences that are far different to their own, why do we need to write about historical fiction?
Yeah, so this is like classic thing where a team goes, if there are other reasons which sometimes can cause the same impact, why do we need more reasons to like get an impact? Like presumably having more works which let people empathize is useful. I explained to you why this method of empathy is unique. People need to stop trying to symmetrize everything. We have a case. Like please respond to my case later on. I would really appreciate it. Why is it then that you're far more able to do this on our side? The third reason then is that cultural context is far more difficult to write a good work out of. This is because like a historical event is far more easier to parameterize, to find the details for, rather than to define what a culture is. Often, the definition of a culture will be defined by the outgroup and the majority. That is, what is left that people are going to understand as being a part of your culture will be defined by that which hasn't been appropriated. And often it will be far more adulterated than your ability to tell a genuine story, one that is accurate because it did happen. The weighing here is simple. As an author, you care about having a dedicated base, even if it's a smaller base. I don't care if you don't become a bestseller, we're able to speak to people and fulfill what that we think was most right. And for all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the DPM for this fine speech, and to continue opposition side and to close the top half of the debate, I'm happy to call the DLO.
Super. Can you see and hear me?
Yeah, for both.
Okay. I'm a bit sick, so if I like start coughing mid-speech, I'll probably just pause my time, drink water, and then continue. For POIs, please turn on your camera and raise your hand. Actually, it would be nice if everyone turn on their cameras. I just think it makes debating more fun. But aside from that, on my next word. The greatest offense to the global socio-political minority is the idea that at an individual level, there is a burden of representation that is imposed on me by default. The idea that because I exist, because I am Black, and because of all the other identities that I hold, I must, in every single thing that I do, center my identity as a Black person from a Southern African country. Often, though, what individuals from these minority identities want is not to be turned into a museum exhibit, but to be humanized, to be seen as a person before their race, before their sexuality, before their identity as a writer, and so on. The idea that by virtue of being an individual from a minority identity, you must exclusively write about your minority status is infantilizing and unreasonable. I want to start by explaining the structural reasons why I am more likely than not to want to write in general and potentially reference my identity rather than being bound to writing exclusively about or primarily about my identity. Three things here. One, minority authors and minority individuals have been reduced to their minority status for nearly their entire lives. That is, for the bulk of their lives, they have been understood and have been perceived in society just as a Black person and nothing more than that, just as a queer person and nothing more than that. All of this means that they're eager to shed off this identity by diversifying the way in which they are perceived in the public eye as being more than simply a minority group or a minority identity. Two, they're aware of their limitations. That is, because no minority identity is a monolith, and because minority individuals recognize this and are most familiar with this, given that, for example, they see within their communities that there are many ways in which people live as Black people, there are many ways in which people live as queer people, these individuals are particularly aware of this specific limitation on how they write about this minority identity. They recognize more specifically that the state of being a minority carries so much diversity within it that to expect that you will capture this diversity in a singular novel is unreasonable and impossible. But three, crucially, sometimes writing about your minority identity is a threat to your welfare. A gay man in Uganda does not have the liberty to write about his sexuality or about sexuality in general because being gay in Uganda is punishable by death. All of this means then that in the vast majority of instances, even a minority author has incentives that mirror those of an author primarily with some minority identity that's infused into it rather than incentives that primarily center their status as a minority. The first question I want to answer is what truly is in your best interest as the author? Abrar opens his speech by contesting this idea that as a minority writer, you must be disposed to writing about your identity as a minority group. He tells you that your incentives are probably similar to those of any other author. You want to make money, you want to be popular, and so on. Given this, he tells you two things. One, that the transformative approach gives you greater creative freedom, and two, that the transformative approach allows you to shed the burden of representation that has been imposed on you for the entirety of your life. I want to add two new mechanisms and two new reasons why the transformative approach is preferable to this. One, the interpretive approach demands energy and research on your part. That is, in order for you to write about a specific historical event, you need to know about that historical event. That is, you need to do research, you need to go into archives and so on. All of this work is mentally taxing, but crucially, the time you spend doing this work trades off time you can spend writing work that's probably easier to write and requires less research. All of this time that you're not writing, that you're not publishing, is time that you could be making money in, but you're not actually doing so. Two, there are only so many histories that you are able to write about. That is, in the vast majority of instances, you don't have an infinite world available to you and at your disposal that you can write about. In most instances, for example, literary agents are primarily interested in reading literature or in publishing literature about events that have already about events that have already been written out, or about events that are more popular in the public eye. All of this means then that there is limited scope to what you can write about because there are only so many histories that you can write. OG says that as an author, OG says that there is a threat in the event that you use a transformative approach, that people will confuse and misinterpret your transformations. But if anything, this is fine. That is, that if now Japanese people read my novel and they think it is about them, and someone from Africa reads the novel and they think it's about them as well, in both instances, I have added to my audience base. That is, in their world, the text is only about and only targeted to those who are written into the text. In our world, people from a range of identities can see themselves in a text. This broadens our audience base at most. Secondly, they tell you all the stuff about why it is good to write about your own identity. I think I've already spoken about this, but I think CEO already talks about why this is likely a massive trivialization in the event that you choose to turn a historical experience that involved probably people losing their lives or something. That this is a massive trivialization of those things. But if anything, I think minorities are aware of the fact that this reductionism expects them to exclusively write about their own pain and suffering. This is very restrictive because sometimes you want to write about like queer joy, for example, or black joy and so on. It is difficult to do this if you are confined to things like historical events that in the vast majority of instances are not very joyful. Here is the way. One, you are an author, you have expenses, you've invested into your career as a writer. You need a return on this investment, and you need one probably as quickly as possible. The weighing then is that insofar as we're able to grant you the kind of audience necessary for you to make money and so on, we're probably better off here. But two, in the event that you as panel accept that representing your identity is the most important thing, we think you probably want to do this to as wide an audience as possible. Our side consolidates that audience for you, allowing you to maximize the social justice instincts. That is, once you have a massive audience, later on, perhaps you can write about your minority identity. Your minority identity is read and understood and appreciated by a greater population of people. But if you prioritize that right now, in the vast majority of instances, it's like you consolidate a base around exclusively that group. CJ.
Is it more mentally taxing to do research online or for Tolkien to take like 20 years to come up with the ideas for Lord of the Rings?
I don't know who Tolkien is. I've never read Lord of the Rings, but I think research is always taxing, especially because in many instances, the kinds of events that these people are writing about are not events that are, for example, very publicly researched, not events that are very publicly available on the internet. If they were, then these authors would lose out on uniqueness, and if they lose out on uniqueness, they don't get money. What is in the interest of your audience? I think your audience is important because one, you need to form a fandom. Two, they're your primary marketing mechanism, and so on. Abrar gives you two specific things that would make your work more appealing to a greater audience. One, the interpretive approach requires a lot of intellectual capital to appreciate. I can only fully appreciate a text about the transatlantic slave trade if I knew about it previously. But two, fantasy writers are disposed to expecting literature that literature that they read will be escapist. OG says that it's harder to create a plot from a fantasy world from scratch. One, the Infoslide says that we can be inspired by real life events than diverge from them. Two, we're happy to accept that this is harder, but the catch is you're aware of your own limitations and confined by them. On your side, you are aware, you're forced to meet up to the expectations set by the fact of history itself. This is stressful. They then say reinterpretation is compelling because it invites people to think about these historical events, but this is non-unique. And more importantly, for less common events that are probably more proximate to you and more important to you, literary agents just won't accept your book because it just feels so strange and so distant to audiences that you won't be able to make anybody at all. The way in here is for all the reasons I already give you, you get a solid audience that is more important than anything else. Oppose.
I think that the allow and all speakers in the top half of the debate, and to open the bottom half, I'm happy to call the member of government. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. I just want to note at the start of my speech that nothing in the motion actually says that you have to write about your culture. You just are a minority and you're writing about culture. I mean, the creators of Outlander were not Scottish, the creators of Avatar were not Chinese, right? Frank Herbert was not a Muslim. So I think a lot of what OO says about how you're being pigeonholed into just writing your own culture doesn't apply, because you can just write about some other historical context and then evade all of the harms that they tell us. But nonetheless, given that everyone else in the debate has made this assumption, I'm going to engage with it, just noting at the start that all of my arguments apply more strongly if you observe that you can write about other cultures as well. So generally, CG is going to agree with OO to the extent that success in the publishing industry is important, because we think it's the precursor to two things. First, we think it's the precursor to OG's benefits, right? If you think that, for example, expounding the social justice issues that your culture is facing is important, to the extent that you think that talking about the stories that your culture has gone through is important, we think that that can only succeed if you have a wide audience in the way that OO suggests. But it's also the precursor to OO's benefits, right? The only way that people are going to be willing to listen to you when you, for example, start writing about a culture other than your own, if you take OO's assumption, is when you become successful, right? When you have a wider audience and are able to diversify the kinds of books you write, and therefore people are going to listen to you. So we think the kind of most important thing at the start of this debate is whether or not you're going to be a successful author, right? Because otherwise, really, no one cares about what you have to say. So why is it likely that you will be a more successful author on our side? Now, Oji's given you a few reasons to this, but we're going to give you, I think, better reasons. First, let me engage with what O says, right? So O first says history is hard. It's hard to do research about history. History is complicated. Now, you don't need to do like a 4-variable regression of tax deductions in Stuart England to write a book about that period, right? You can just read a book about it, something authors are quite good at doing, and understand most of what you need to do. And as my as my partner's POI notes, creating an entire fictional world from scratch is much harder. Yes, you can be inspired by a real world culture, but you need to fill in everything else on your own, right? I mean, I don't think it was particularly easy, for example, for Frank Herbert to invent the whole Dune universe just knowing that there was a Mahdi in Islam and it played a significant role. So we think that actually ops mechanism is much harder. I would also note that O's other arguments aren't very clear, right? They sort of gesture at some things about why people are more likely to accept pure fantasy worlds, but none of those are actually arguments. They're just sort of vague sentences that don't really make a point. Here are some reasons why you're more likely to be successful as a writer of historical, not really historical fiction, but historical inspired fiction than a completely new fantasy world. First is because people already have some familiarity with history, right? When you write about, for example, the Second World War, or for example, the Cold War, or these events which actually happened, lots of people around the world have memory of that, or at least have some familiarity with that through history textbooks, through what their family told them, through the stories of their culture, and so on. Compare that to an entirely new fictional world, yes, maybe inspired by some real-world culture, but significantly removed from that in the world of opposition, right? Most people are not serious readers. In fact, most people are not readers at all. People only pick up books if they think there's something that they can already identify with in that book and something that they can be familiar with, right? Dune is a good example of this, right? Of course, Frank Herbert was extremely inventive in creating Dune, but as a result, the book was almost a non-seller for many decades, right? It was a kind of cult classic before it finally broke into the mainstream decades after he wrote that book, right? And that is the kind of cognitive barrier people face when engaging with an entirely foreign book, one that is completely outside their experience or anything they learned in school or anything their family taught them. Second, the publishing industry also plays a key role here, right? I think none of the top half teams really analyze the role that the publishing industry faces. It's not as if you can just think of a book and then write it and then your book will be sold in bookshops, right? You need to actually pitch your book to a publisher to get them to publish it. Now, what is the publisher looking at when they analyze whether or not to publish your book? First of all, I mean, all teams in this debate have made, I think, the fair assumption that you're not already a successful author, right? So you have no track record of success with which to show the publishing industry you can actually write the book in the way opposition suggests. So the publishing industry is going to make a few assumptions, right? First of all, they're going to make the assumption that you're probably not a very good author, right? Because the median author isn't very good. And therefore, the median author who is not very good is probably not going to be successful at writing a wholly new fantasy book in the way Op suggests, because it is a much harder task. What is the median author more likely to be able to do? Well, the median author is probably more likely to just write another book in the historically inspired fiction genre, a genre which is extremely popular at the moment. And therefore, the publishing industry's point of view is that you're more likely to be successful as an author if you write a book in government's world. That's extremely important because it means you only get the publishing contract and get a foot in the door if you do government's model, and you don't if you do opposition's model. So for those reasons, we think you're more likely to be a successful author on our side, which unlocks all the benefits which top half talked about. Thirdly, we think that this is not just a question of what you choose to do or what you have the freedom to do, right? Our opening half has kind of been obsessed with this question about, does the minority author prefer to do this or prefer to do that? But we think a minority author, to some extent, not to a full extent, but to some extent, has also a responsibility to write about their own culture, if indeed that is the debate at hand. For two reasons, right? First, because they benefited from that culture and therefore, have some kind of tie to that culture which they ought to repay by representing it properly. But secondly, and far more importantly, because if they don't, someone will write a worse book in their place, right? If you don't write your sensitive account of your own culture, then some other author who has no affinity to your culture at all is just going to write a worse book in your place. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that someone goes into the bookshop and sees two books on the table. One is written by a minority author and one is written by a non-minority author, and therefore you're kind of combating that book directly. What I'm saying is that you should contribute to the general world of historically inspired books by writing a book that is more sensitively attuned to the concerns of that minority group, if indeed you have an actual responsibility to that group by coming from it. So for those reasons, we think we evade the top half clash about what this person wants to do, because it's not just a question of what the minority author wants to do. We think they also have some level of responsibility to write a properly sensitive story about that culture to begin with. Finally, I want to fill the gap that one of the teams pointed out in a POI to OG, which is why can't you just write historical fiction or history, and why must it be the specific kind of historically inspired fiction that both government teams are talking about? The reason is because you want to write things that are not true. Right? You want to write, for example, an alternate universe in which the Americas colonized Europe, right? Or an alternate universe in which certain types of slavery didn't take place or certain wars went in a different direction. You can't do that if you're writing historical fiction or history. And the important function of that kind of literature is to show the possibilities, right? To for example, dismantle colonialist narratives of inherent European superiority by imagining a world in which European colonization went a very different way. And that is a unique benefit which historically inspired fiction can give you, which real historical fiction or real history never can. For all of those reasons, CG.
I thank the member of government for his signed speech, and to continue the opposition side of the debate, I'm happy to call the member of opposition. Here.
Just checking if I'm audible.
You are.
It's a real shame that the primary conception of art in this debate is either a vehicle for political polemics or a ticket to fame and fortune. Closing opposition will provide two extensions. First, we'll explain why the experience of creating art is inherently more enjoyable in our world and why that's a debate-winning benefit. And secondly, we'll explain why the reception of reinterpretational work will be highly politicized, inviting controversy rather than the common dialogue the government bench requires it to be. Briefly, I note that closing government's observation that you can write about other cultures is firstly a knife of their opening, so it's impermissible. And secondly, if they want and care about freedom, we get more freedom in our world because we're not wedded to any culture, period. This is an uncomparative claim. So let's start on the first claim. Why is the experience of creating art inherently more enjoyable in our world? I want to begin by explaining why this is clearly the most important impact in the round. Firstly, because it's the most certain. Because, as closing government, I guess, helpfully identifies, no one knows how many copies of the book you might sell. No one knows how audiences are likely to perceive that. That is beyond your control, whereas this is something that is knowable to the actor. Secondly, because this benefit is a precondition to maintaining an artistic career in the first place. Because as we will explain, writing historical and reinterpretive fiction is something that is emotionally draining. You're likely to burn out. And to the extent that government bench requires you to believe that artists have a meaningful platform, you need to be and maintain in that career to have and use that platform, which is precisely what is not likely to happen in their world. There are two broad reasons as to why people are likely to burn out in their world. First, because they suffer from trauma fatigue. Writing about and researching about historical oppression, about colonialism, about slavery is something that is likely to be emotionally taxing and draining. Opening governments say, well, you're a minority, so therefore everything that you experience is psychological violence, so you'll feel an overwhelming ethical compulsion to stop it. Firstly, I challenge opening government to make the claim that people from minority backgrounds primarily define their identity around their suffering and around their oppression. Secondly, even if this is true, they never explain why people couldn't fulfill that duty in other ways, as a voter, as a protester on the streets, by giving back to their communities. The fact that these people, if they believe that, are likely to make those significant efforts in their political life, it's very likely that they view their artistic life as a conduit for doing something different, as a way of escaping from that psychological torture that they concede is endless, as a way of maybe doing something more and about reshaping your identity in a way that is not defined around your racial oppression and your racial injustice. But thirdly, because the revealed preference trick that government bench relies upon goes the other way. Government bench's characterization, which have you believe that this person would sign up to be a political activist or a politician rather than a writer of fiction or like a historian, maybe even. But clearly you chose to be a writer, which means that you, as a way of revealed preference, care about the artistic escape valve that your work provides. And secondly, care not about the value of art as a means of a political expression, but a means of personal and artistic expression, which is what we provide. So, in our world, we provide that sense of release, And more importantly, we give people the ability to write an imperative narrative, because instead of writing what is always going to be a sad and unfortunate ending, because that is the ending of history that is mandated in the genre, you get to write a story where the characters from minority backgrounds have agency, have strength, have autonomy. Look to, for example, Black Panther, which is a beautiful vision of how Pan-African identities can be a position of technological process of strength. That is the relief and the positive sense of empowerment that you only get in our world. They get misery and the fatigue of reliving your traumas that you apparently live every day. Second thing to say is that even if you accept Government Bench's characterization, the problem is that they have never explained why the burden of that fidelity wouldn't be something that was incredibly exhausting. Our opening says, well, research is time consuming, which is true, I guess, but a bit flippant, because we think the more relevant aspect of it is that the anxiety about whether your depiction will be interpreted in the way you intended it to be. Because crucially, you're not writing a history book, you're writing a work of fiction. You're inherently obscuring the political message you intended to say through a figurative device or a conceit. And that abstraction, firstly, always opens the door to misinterpretation, that in fact doubles down upon stereotypes instead of breaking them apart. And secondly, invites you to critique from your own community that you let them down. You do not provide an authentic interpretation. See, for example, how a lot of the backlash against Crazy Rich Asians was most right from the Asian American community themselves. Even if that pressure does not exist, it is a pressure that is internalized by these members of the minority themselves because they want to do a good job, but they feel that enormous anxiety because they never know whether people will interpret it in that way, because it's a work of fiction that requires a degree of interpretation from the audience rather than a political script. So, the fact that that burden is likely to be overwhelming, it means that, and that anxiety that you can't really ever resolve because you don't really know how people have interpreted your work, because that the work of fiction lives in that audience's head, means that this is likely to be a deeply, deeply, profoundly upsetting and awful way of experiencing your art, so you burn out in their world. Next extension. This will be received in a politicized way, inviting controversy rather than common dialogue. Before that, OG.
Even if you're right, it's quite easy for you to stop writing work that is emotionally painful. Our emotional benefits of catharsis and getting a loyal base are far more certain and important to most writers.
No, because like you're saying, oh, if it's emotionally painful, stop writing. Well, writing is your primary joy. The fact that you're a writer, that is the harm that we are talking about. So, why would this be received badly? Government, I guess, broadly claims that there is demand for historical fiction from an academic perspective, but that's just true of historical fiction written by white composers, like TV shows like Shogun or Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. When you're approaching it from a minority writer, the reality of racial discrimination and bigotry is that white readers believe that you must have some kind of agenda, which means you're not likely to create common ground and dialogue. You're likely to invite massive controversy over it. That's for three reasons. First, because inherently, as a white audience, confronting the idea that you are responsible for oppression, for suffering, and evil is something that is very difficult for people to do. Most people do not want to think that they're a bad person, and the way people rationalize it is to say that was the fault of my ancestors hundreds of years ago, not a fault of me now. Now, when that book about slavery is written by a white author, people are fine with that. White audiences are fine with that. But when it's written by a black author, they aren't fine with it because they perceive it to be a silent accusation of guilt, which they do not feel like they should be guilty of, which is why they will not interpret it well. They will in fact be opposed to it and there'll be backlash. Secondly, the fact that you approach the subject matter indirectly by a work of fiction is likely to draw incredible amounts of suspicion. You're likely to be accused of historical revisionism. You're likely to be accused of changing up the facts in order to suit your agenda, because that is what you have literally done. You give that a license for the right to accept you. And not only are you trying to get acceptance from the white community, you're also trying to get acceptance from your minority community, which is also similarly vexed. For those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for this fine speech, and to conclude the government service debate, I am here to call the government whip. Hear, hear.
Hi everyone, he and pronouns. If there are any POIs, please put them in the chat. Sorry.
First, I'm going to do a bit of independent rebuttal to closing opposition. Then I'm going to explain our two extensions, which clearly win us the round. Firstly, why our work is likely to be more successful and published importantly in the first place. And secondly, why the things you write about are better under our side of the house. Firstly, dealing with closing opposition and some of the miscellaneous material that we get from them. The first thing to point out is their argument on misinterpretations. The first thing I'd like to point out here is that opposition is actually much more likely to be misinterpreted because you don't have anything tangible to anchor that particular story to. So if you're, for example, creating some sort of society under their side of the house that has elements of, for example, racism or discrimination, that is more likely to be misinterpreted in terms of assigning, for example, who is supposed to be the oppressor or who is supposed to be the oppressed under their side of the house in terms of the parallels that are obfuscated under their side of the house. Or there's a second possibility here, which is that people might just miss it. I think most people probably don't realize that Dune is supposed to be and is representative of things like Islamic beliefs. Again, because the clues and details are not directly tied, because there are no direct references, for example, to this particular time period that is being mentioned, or maybe this is just like a completely different like universe entirely, all the benefits of representation, all the sort of like messages that you want to get across go away if people just miss it. And what that necessarily means is, given the fact that, you know, authors have a variety of incentives in this debate, what we would probably say is that most authors want to be able to communicate some level of message to their work and have that be sort of widely received and that be sort of like accepted, right? That is the basis for which closing opposition runs their misinterpretation argument, and why misinterpretation is a harm to begin with. It's because you care about the opinions of other people. So closing opposition cannot equally run just an argument that, you know, you'll be happy if you get some level of creative freedom. Like people, if they just want to get creative freedom and want to just like enjoy the art of like writing, probably just write on AO3 or like Wattpad or whatever. It is clearly different because you're an author looking to get published, looking to get your opinions across. And if they think misinterpretation is bad, it is clearly worse under closing opposition. The second thing that they say is that this invites controversy and backlash. The first thing to point out is that as closing opposition observes, if like white audiences are so racist and like, you know, are always going to think you have an agenda, I'm not sure why pretty much any form of semblance of writing a story that is related towards like any issue or societal issue at all won't equally be sort of painted as having an agenda, right? What this essentially means for closing opposition is that they are the ones that are limiting themselves from creative freedom, because now all the stories that you can write about under their side of the house under fear of backlash are basically stories that are harmless, stories that have no real meaning, stories that never criticize like, you know, societal structures, which basically just limits the amount of stories that you can write about. Like maybe you'll write a few romance stories here and there, but if we think generally creative freedom is good for everyone, clearly you have less of that under closing opposition because you're so scared of backlash. The second thing to point out is that historical revisionism is probably also not a valid concern here, because the genre we are writing is explicitly science fiction and explicitly alternative history. It is different if, for example, we were to brand ourselves as a historical, like literary history author, for example. This genre is uniquely speculative, and I think vast majority of people know that. Lastly, I just don't think backlash is a reason to not write something if you think it's a good thing. Like when Atwood wrote Handmaid's Tale and like talked about feminism, I'm sure there was a lot of backlash there from Christian groups and Christian fundamentalists. That is not a reason to not do anything. In fact, I think that backlash may be good. Firstly, because now you feel like a martyr. You feel like you're doing the right thing. If you are getting backlash, you feel like you're, you know, fighting for your community and contributing in a much more meaningful way, exactly because there's backlash against you. But secondly, I just think controversy means that you get things such as more media coverage. You get invited towards public forums and debates that are not just like book talks at the local library. All this means that you'll have far more ability to be discovered by, yes, maybe some racist people, but also the vast majority of the other audience, thus like increasing your audience base, increasing the amount of support that you're likely to have because you're able to reach other people as well. All of that takes out closing opposition. Now let's go on as to why the work will be more successful. I want to first highlight that in opening opposition's best case, right? Sometimes minority authors don't want to write about purely just being a minority. And we agree with this. They don't have to, as opening government sort of assumes that they do. And no, this is not a knife. Opening government is just saying that this is what they think they want to do. We're just saying that sometimes authors want to do what OO says, which is like completely fair, right? And so what that means is, even if your interest is to just write more generally in opening opposition's best case, our argument still applies, because our argument is about generally why every single piece of fiction you write under historical or sort of like under reinterpretive fiction is likely to be one that is more successful and more likely to publish. Tajei gives you a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, because people have already some level of familiarity with maybe the premises of that plot, and there's for a less of a cognitive barrier, right? Like when people decide to read books, they probably just like browse through the library or browse through the bookstore, look at like the cover and like look a bit at like the synopsis at the back, if people don't have immediately something to attach to it, like if you're creating a sort of intricate plot, it's very, very hard to get people into it in that sort of little blurb compared to when you know a story is about World War I and it's going to sort of like, fill in your curiosities about what you wanted to know during history class. All of that, I think that level of familiarity makes it far easier for people to get into the story and get into the book to begin with, and even pick it up to begin with. Secondly, as we've explained, you're also just more likely to get published. And this is the real kicker. There are already parallel examples to this, right? If you've been on TikTok, the reason why there are so many Greek mythological retellings, such as Circe, such as Song of Achilles everywhere, is because those are more likely to get published because the stories are already compelling. So even a bad author or a median author, has already good material to start off with. So you can't possibly fuck it up that bad under our side of the house. Comparatively, it is hard to be the next Tolkien. It is hard to write the next Harry Potter under their side, per the reasons that we've explained. Thirdly, because the audience is likely to be more empathetic, and the audience is likely, again, as I pointed out, to be attracted towards this type of work. I think opening oppositions toward this say that you need a lot of research. Before I move on, I'll take opening opposition.
There are many books that have been written about the Cold War. It's harder to differentiate to publishers if you're talking about common historical events. And if no one knows the historical event, then it's too foreign for publishers. They still won't take it.
Okay, then choose a historical event that like somewhere in the middle. There are so many historical events in the world. There are so many levels of it, even like regions and like the different histories that they have. You can write about like Arthurian England. You can write about the Cold War if you wanted to. Like, I'm just not convinced that it has to be one or the other. There is probably some level of middle ground. Like, we can't have possibly written like works about literally every part of history, guys. Okay, so on the mentally taxing point, as you pointed out, it is far more mentally taxing under their side of the house. Why does this argument win us around? Firstly, CO is correct that it is a relatively more certain benefit to just like get artistic expression. But if the only benefit of CO is that you get artistic expression, that's kind of shit, right? You want to be able to be published, and any prerequisite of success, any prerequisite of like, getting your message across and getting any fulfillment from your art is dependent on you getting published and people picking up your book, which also takes us over opening governments because we actually explain why these things happen. Finally, why is it that you want to write about this? I think, as we pointed out, if you don't write about this, someone else will write about it. And it doesn't matter if this person is not necessarily racist or is necessarily malicious. What matters is that you believe that you are better at writing this. You believe that you have your own unique perspective to offer in this conversation. That is the reason why you want to use alternative fiction in order to like officiate a message. For those reasons, very proud to stand closing up.
I thank the government whip for this